Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Annemai van der Meer. I'm with TAUS, and I'm very happy to be hosting this webinar today on interpreting cultural context. I'll just introduce the topic briefly before I introduce the speakers today. We all know by now probably that the industry is changing. We're implementing new technologies, changing our workflows, and all to adapt to these new changes. And we realize that we have to move away from just translation. Maybe localization is not even a good enough term anymore. Culture becomes more and more important when exploring new markets. Interpreting cultural context is imperative in order to provide a good translation. And we have two speakers on this webinar today who know a lot more about this, who have a lot more experience about this. But also, before we go into the introductions, I'd like to just point your attention to this Nunc est Tempus ebook that we published last December. You must have heard about it by now. It sort of is a roadmap to redesign your translation business. It has a lot of different chapters in it about, for example, machine learning, machine translation, neural machine translation, of course, the datafication of translation, speech translation, about the geo-linguistic shifts. We're not just focused on the West anymore. There are more markets out there. We're realizing that going vertical, so focusing on the vertical markets as well. Quality is always an important subject, and we're going deeper into that, the roadmap of quality here as well. And of course, this interpreting cultural context and transcreation. The actual host of this webinar is Paula Shannon, industry expert, it says here, Paula, formerly Lionbridge. And you might have met her already at our previous webinars on the modern translation pipeline. Paula, you'll be moderating this panel today, which is one of the things you do best. And I'd like to ask you to please introduce the speakers today.
Thank you very much, Annemai, and I'm delighted because I think that we have in our two speakers today just such a wealth of experience, and hopefully you'll also see very quickly coming at this question from a different angle. And what I mean is specific to the brands that they represent, but also their own experience and background, I think is fascinating when you consider that they've focused it in the area of localization and specifically this area of transcreation and cultural adaptation. So working alphabetically, so from the left, Sasan Banava, who's the head of localization at Uber. And Sasan has been at Uber, I believe, since 2015, but he was prior to that about 7.5 years deep within Google as a program manager, handling, among other things, the entire localization chain for mobile, Google+, for social media apps, and for mobile maps. So he brings a tremendous amount of experience. Sasan, in a kind of interesting link, your background is a very, I would say, esoteric degree. I mean, a very, if we're talking about the modern translation pipeline, I would put a Near Eastern Studies degree from Cal Berkeley with a focus on Persian way on the high end of the quality spectrum. So I thought that was kind of intriguing. But we'll see as we move to an introduction of Christopher Dell that he similarly brings an intriguing perspective with an art history major from the prestigious Courtauld Institute in London. And so I'm hoping that this will weave into your perspectives, gentlemen, as we go through. Chris with us today is the director content agency at booking.com. And Chris has a long pedigree of working not just with content creation and translation, as he does now, which is what makes it fascinating to have him on the panel, because his role combines these two critical processes. But he really came from the content side of the house, if I could characterize it as such, at booking.com. And prior to working purely in content, was deeply involved in reviews and worked as a reviews manager. So why do I put the focus on that? Because we're now kind of getting to the essence of experience in trusted content. What makes good content? What type of content is relevant for the brand and engenders consumer loyalty and consumer buying? So I can't wait to hear some of Chris's ideas on that. So I think that before we jump in, just a bit of framing and context. Why is it interesting to have these two very kind of somewhat related but very different companies joining us today on the webinar? I think what will come out very quickly is that both of them have this globalization at the core. Booking.com, originally a Dutch company. Chris is based in Amsterdam still, the operations and the nexus of work done there. But why is that intriguing is that their strength in the European Union, the strength in global markets, enables them to actually look back at markets like North America as just another regional market. In fact, one of Booking.com's regional marketing heads, who owns the Americas region, talked about, quote, how they translate a certain thing for the US audience. And we always have spoken about English being just another language, but I think it's fascinating that in this case, it really is part of the culture. And I think that as we look towards Uber, and we'll hear more from Sasan, going back to 2014, 2015, there wasn't a business class taught that didn't focus on Uber's kind of think local to expand globally concept. The market entry, the power behind the most successful IPO at that time in the world. And so much was written about how this globalization backbone was really a big part of it. And yet, as we all do, both brands have encountered friction and difficulties as they adapt to local markets. So I'd like to jump in then, and we'll start, Sasan, maybe with you. If you want to give just an overview about what transcreation really is for you, the definition, and whether or not you feel within Uber you have a distinct process for this very high quality translation product, if I could say.
Thanks, Paula. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Transcreation for us means adapting source message to the region locale we're localizing into, and usually involves deviation from source content to ensure we stay hyper local and very relevant to the audience and users of our products. We have two versions of transcreation at Uber: full transcreation, which involves a lot more deviation for marketing content, and light transcreation, which is lighter touch, but it still involves thinking creatively when you're localizing the content. Due to our business needs, we are primarily focusing on light transcreation right now.
Chris, if I can ask you whether or not you've got a specific or a distinctive process within Booking.com for transcreation, and again, as Sasan indicated or illustrated, do you have any different levels? And maybe, Sasan, I'll come back to you as well to understand how many languages for how many languages you produce this transcreated content. So Chris, first to you.
Well, again, first, it's a real pleasure to be here and have a chance to talk a little bit about what we do here in Booking.com. We have 8 defined language services actually within Booking.com. They're kind of internal services, but also it ensures then that whoever is requesting services from us within the business, they get exactly what they've asked for. One of these is transcreation, and actually right now it's approximately 10% of our total kind of translations throughput. It's very similar to Sasan. It's where we're deviating quite a bit from source to maybe, for example, on the content side, to give completely different examples of locations, so the actual content changes around a similar framework, similar goal with the content, but maybe different examples. Around about 40% of our work actually is what we would call localization, but I think other people potentially would call transcreation or like a light transcreation, which is it's product copy. So it's our navigation copy, for example, on our platform. We also do, I think, more and more transcreation towards our partners, because of course Booking.com is a platform. So we have partners on one side, we have customers on the other. And while we're fundamentally customer-driven platform, increasingly we're thinking, hey, how do we connect with partners? Because of course we have not just customers from over 200 countries, but also partners in over 200 countries. And when I say partners, by the way, I mean accommodation providers.
Right. And so that's interesting, Christopher, because I know that the revenue model at Booking.com, you know, while a large amount of direct to consumer, you've got your agency model and your partner model. So maybe we can probe that a bit more when we do examples, you know, about what types of adaptation or different transcreation steps you take. Susanna, I think in terms of the number of languages and countries you cover, I've seen so many different ciphers, I'm confused. I mean, I saw 801 cities and 82 or 84 languages. Can you set the record straight so that we know?
Sure. We are in 700 plus cities and in 50 languages, 50 plus languages. Obviously, there was just this grab deal in Southeast Asia, so there are some languages to be offboarded, and we are always looking at what languages to onboard, what languages to offboard based on our business needs. So the number of countries, 100, I believe it's 70 countries plus.
All right, so an enormous range. And now jumping back a bit for both of our panelists, as you look at your own companies, and you've both been with your companies and brands long enough to understand the kind of leadership message, the corporate positioning, how do you see globalization working its way through the corporate strategy? So Chris, is there anything that you can share about where an awareness perhaps at the C-level of the importance of globalization? And Susanna, I'll come back to you on the same question after.
So I think localization, or the idea that we want to become a global platform, has been kind of baked into Booking.com from the beginning. And that comes, I guess, from the fact that we were founded in the Netherlands in 1996. And for those of you who haven't been to the Netherlands, it's not a huge country. You can drive across it in maybe 2.5, 3 hours. No, apologies to TAUS, who are obviously based in Amsterdam as well, but it's a small country. And indeed, if we were still selling Dutch hotels to Dutch customers, then we wouldn't have got very far at all. To a certain extent, I think Booking.com, we were quite lucky that we not only kind of caught the first wave of the internet, but we also caught the emergence of, say, low-cost carriers, so kind of EasyJet, Ryanair, etc., within Europe. And then the kind of unbundling of travel. Also, of course, the euro coming in. So actually, for us, it was logical to start expanding through Europe very, very quickly. But here's the thing about Europe compared with, say, the States. The States is a colossal market that you can grow and grow for maybe kind of 15, 20 years and still not fully capture. But in Europe, you need to adapt very, very quickly. So the moment I think our first office outside of Amsterdam was in Paris. So we said, okay, great, now we can sell French hotels to Dutch people, but very quickly, our partners also need our extranet in French, but also then why don't we sell Dutch hotels to French people as well? So actually, I'd say localization was completely kind of baked into the product from the very beginning. And again, I mean, we have a network of close to 200 offices around the world. That local presence, having our account management teams, for example, sitting in local markets, has always been incredibly important to us, being as close to partners and then, of course, close to customers as possible.
Well, that's fascinating. And again, the story that I've seen, you know, of as you mentioned, I mean, the founding in the Netherlands, I think changes the perspective. I think for a lot of the participants, maybe dialed in from North America, they might always think of Booking.com as being smaller, somehow behind, you know, the size, anyway, revenue size of an Expedia, Airbnb, not that you compete head on with either of them, just overlapping. And your numbers are now wound up within the parent company. But you know, I know that your size is astonishing for many. You've just added your millionth property, you know, to the portfolio. And I believe that you have more non-hotel properties than any other platform, including Airbnb. Is that true?
This is, yeah, indeed. Yeah, we've actually kind of, we look at it slightly differently at the moment, or recently we changed our the way we report to reported listings, and indeed, it looks like the largest platform globally. Certainly in terms of hotel accommodation, the more conventional properties we have on Booking.com, with the, I think, the largest in the world. To be honest, that's never entirely been our goal. I think generally we try to be remain kind of grounded and reasonably humble as an organization. Dutch, you could say.
Well, you're Dutch. I was going to say you're Dutch, so that's good. But I just think the scope of your operations is really intriguing, for the participants. And Susanne, of course, the Uber brand, is so well known. But nonetheless, what's your view about maybe how that call to globalization has changed as a message within Uber? I mean, I don't mean to bring out any negative information on the call, but both brands have faced headwinds in market. I mean, Chris, you're so unfortunate. Here you are, basically a Dutch brand gone American, and now, Russia is threatening sanctions because you're viewed as being American. And Susanne, of course, there's been well-documented resistance in certain markets and cultures to the Uber brand. So how have you seen that play out in terms of the way that global is embraced culturally at a corporate level within Uber?
Great question. When I joined in 2015, we followed a typical journey of a Silicon Valley company. There are already a bunch of markets and they're trying to catch up. So when I came in, Uber was already in a lot of countries and 30 plus languages, and this rocket ship was taking off, and I was asked to start catching up, bring the quality at a great level. And it took us a couple of months to get into CEO's calendar, but we were able to pitch that we need an in-house team. A lot of successful companies in Silicon Valley, they have this hybrid model of in-house team and utilizing big MLBs to scale their operations and get the brand tone and voice right. Was a lot of chaos. So Uber was based on a model that has central office in San Francisco, but the city teams also were empowered to run their city. So with global expansion came global chaos, and there was really a need to define that tone and voice and brand at headquarters and give some leeway for local market to adopt the message and make it hyper localized. So it's been a very interesting and challenging journey.
Well, we're about to transition to a part of the webinar where we can hear more specifically about that. Before we get into maybe some of the specific examples, one more large question. We hear a lot about intelligent content delivery, and both of you have a tremendous amount of experience. But when we use those terms, what does that mean to you, Chris, with your background in content creation?
Well, I'm not going to lie, I'm puzzled by this term, and I know it's being used a lot in the industry at the moment. I think I would interpret it as delivering the right content to the right people at the right time, and by right people I mean the kind of right consumer. So for me, I suppose I see it as part of a general trend towards personalization.
Yeah.
Which is well, I mean, that's what digital ultimately is all about, the ability to serve not just the right search results, but a more kind of total experience when it comes to content. So potentially tailoring, say, descriptions of destinations or of properties that you could book to a particular user. This is, well, I think there are a few platforms out there that are already doing this reasonably successfully. I think Amazon, for example, has had a great recommendation engine for a very long time. So I think for me that would be, yeah, I think that's what I would describe it as.
Yes, and it's interesting. I mean, we will circle back on the role that trusted content would have. I mean, personalization on a digital end of the mechanism for making this happen, but then having that content, Christopher, as you say, so that it is tailored and suited to the person. I know we won't talk about that today. You and I discussed that there are some really interesting things going on in the industry, in the travel industry specifically, even within Booking.com, for heavy use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to tailor this content. I mean, who knows? Maybe we'll be talking about that sometime next year, Christopher. But Sasan, do you have any views on that? This notion of intelligent content delivery and maybe how transcreation would play into that?
I agree with Chris. This term obviously is being tossed around. And at least my view of it is that delivering content at various quality bars. And so what I envision is a product content matrix, and we set different quality bars and even turnaround time. So for instance, a UI could be just quickly translated and maybe a linguistic QA before a major launch, while marketing could involve a full transcreation, longer cycle, take our time, and deliver a good hyper-localized content. And when it comes maybe to some low quality content, such as Help Center, if it's for tier 3 languages or languages that is not utilized, machine translation is utilized. So having this notion of different standards for different segments of the product and content.
Thank you, Sasan. And I think you can see from a TAUS perspective, looking at that modern translation pipeline, we've spent a lot of time in the last couple of webinars focusing on the kind of more industrial side of it, the high volume, fully automated translation, good enough, use of heavy machine translation. And in contrast, I think what's interesting today is we're going to be focusing more on this bespoke, the human, the high touch, but both require this intelligent content delivery mechanism. So thanks. I think that links us back to where we want to be in today's podcast. So now going over to kind of your battlefield examples and lessons learned. Chris, do you have any examples of actual kind of transcreation, things that have been done within Booking.com? And of course, feel free to elaborate on any kind of disasters, because the audience, being only human, they're really here for the disasters, right? They want to hear where you got something wrong, or we have our own examples of transcreation missteps. But joking aside, anything that you can do to share with us the journey that you've taken?
No, absolutely. I can give an example of something we've been working on quite recently, which I find super interesting, which is it's a content marketing project. We call it Unpacked. Basically, it's a sort of blog with kind of really some nice articles, actually really well-written articles, which we tested first in English, and we saw, hey, there's real interest in this. The content is great. We started actually initially then just translating directly into other languages to see how that landed. And then very soon after that, we said, well, look, actually we have locally based language specialists. Almost all of our language specialists actually sit in the market that they cover. So why don't we, for example, give free rein or more latitude to the language specialist sitting in Rome looking after Italian to do a bit of research and maybe come up with slightly different lists, or the same list but with slightly different content that's tailored. We actually almost kind of moved towards sort of copywriting in Italian, but off the English framework. It's difficult to say whether that's going to be disastrous or not yet. It's still kind of very much in experimental phase. We see, by the way, that the different languages respond differently, or the success is different for different languages. And I think now we're at the phase where, okay, is that to do with the content, the approach, or do we need to go even further to make it really kind of locally relevant for our customers?
And are there any kind of pits or missteps that you've made kind of at a larger level, either with an application, an approach, a new service launched in a market where it perhaps was not a good fit?
We are actually relatively cautious within Booking.com. We do an awful lot of A/B testing. I think that's pretty well known, which is to say, consumers coming to booking.com will be split often into two groups, and they'll see variants of the website. Sometimes these experiments are neither copy-driven, and we can learn a huge amount from that in terms of consumer preferences when it comes to language. So I'd say actually the platform has been built fairly incrementally through kind of constant testing. And this obviously is kind of a very typical approach across e-commerce in general. So I'd say, yeah, cautious.
All right.
Sensible.
But still very good. And I think, Sasan, obviously you were moving at the pace of a Silicon Valley startup. So we have to believe that there are some great lessons learned. And I give you the floor. I have to share with the audience, I kind of know some of the examples that Sasan will share, and they're going to be really fun. So why don't you take it away, Sasan? And if you're willing to, let's go through a whole lot of the experiences that you and your team have had.
Sure, I'll go through a few examples. I'll start with my all-time favorite. We actually pitched this to our CEO when we wanted to ask for starting in-house localization team. So in the Uber app, you have this sentence, where would you like to be picked up? And the word pickup in several South American countries has a very sexual connotation. So where would you like to have sex? And of course, when we launch into Argentina, the term ended up making it to social media, and companies that started advertising their product with the screenshot of the Uber app that where would you like to have be picked up, in quotation mark. So it's example of being mindful of picking a term that's generally respectable and understood by 19 different South American countries. So there are a few other examples I can go over with my Persian language background and love of poetry. I like this particular copy for Halloween. Our English copy
I do too, because of the French Canadian aspect. And I'm wondering, I'm going to find out if my favorite translator in the world had a hand in this, but I'll do that afterwards. So please explain this one to us.
Sure. So the English copy says, "The hour is late, the moon is full, a lonely creature howls somewhere in a spooky house, someone's stomach growls." And the French Canadian copy, once back translated, it would say, "The night is pitch black, the moon is full, and casts its light over the pumpkins. Not far away are lost souls whose stomachs growl." To me, this is a great example of adapting the content, making it rhyme and make sense in the target language. So that's a great example to share.
I agree. And for those on the phone, I mean, the word had to be substituted for pumpkin because the rhyme around citrouille was fantastic. So that's a great example, Sasan. Thanks.
Sure.
It's great to hear these examples. It reminds me actually a few years ago when we launched our Genius program, which, well, some of the listeners, I guess, will be familiar with if you book frequently enough with us. But actually the word genius just has radically different connotations in different parts of the world, and in many languages had no translation whatsoever. I remember in, I think it was one of the Baltic languages, actually found that we could, instead of genius, substitute the name of a local kind of mythological character who was known to be extremely smart. And I love that as a kind of great example of transcreation or very deep kind of localization, making it just land well.
No, these are the things that make a product authentic, right, in local market. And I've used examples many times in coming back to where I live in the French Canadian market. We have such different terminology, and one of the better known GPS mapping programs was having difficulty. And it really came down to the fact that we call convenience stores in English, we use the abbreviation of the French word dépanneur, which is nobody understands because they think dépanneuse, you know, a tow truck in French. Well, in French Canadian, you're in crisis, on panne, and the dépanneur, the little 7-Eleven quick shop, gets you out of crisis. So it's a dépanneur. And in English, we call it the DEP. So, you know, if you localized a GPS kind of mobile type of, in the old days, when these were purchased and not in car, and you didn't have this as a search option, you'd be missing out on all of that. So this is the stuff we all live for, right? This is what we originally, what hooked us into the language industry. For some of us, of course, marrying this high quality output with the modern translation pipeline is a challenge. I'd like to come back and ask you both. I know we spoke about the different quality levels that you had for creation. Backing up now, for all of the content that you output, Christopher, how many different quality levels do you have? I was fascinating because based on what you told us earlier, you could almost make an argument that 50% of what you do is kind of transcreation. But what are the different levels that you have for all of the content?
So as I mentioned, we have 8 different kind of language services, and within that we actually have 4 different kind of quality thresholds. It's difficult for me to go into a huge amount of detail right now because we're actually just transitioning to a completely new system, which is these 4 thresholds, and we haven't kind of fully rolled it out even internally yet. But I mean, I think for us, we're very interested in sort of adequacy fluency, which are the very kind of typical kind of quality parameters. But obviously market fit is absolutely critical for us. And if indeed it's a transcreation service that's been requested, then we want to see like much more effort or kind of much more creativity put into it.
And I'll come back to this, Chris, but we'll contrast some of this with areas in which you might be using machine translation and kind of good enough output in a moment. But Sasan, same question for you. Overall, with all the content that you output, do you have a sense of the different number of quality levels that you aim for?
Sure. I'll start by saying we are a 2.5-year-old localization company. So obviously, some of the companies in Silicon Valley that have been around or globally 15, 20 years, there's just going to be more maturity in the processes of measuring and implementing quality levels. But at Uber, we have a review vendor that checks the work of our translation vendor based on some quality categories, similar to the DQF model of TAUS. We have Review the Reviewer program, which ensures consistency of the review process, and all of our reviewers are following the same guideline. In addition, we have our in-house language managers who own their own language quality in addition to few additional languages, and they're able to guide both translation and review vendors. And we are working on defining quality at next 2 levels, or what it means at Uber. One would be city team feedback, which right now we informally incorporate their feedbacks, but we would like to have a more standardized metric-driven process. And then ultimately, the one that matters the most is end user feedback and surveys. Yeah.
And if you don't mind, Sasan, let's continue on that path, because one of the questions I was most interested to ask was exactly that. So how, for this higher quality transcreated output, how do you measure and benchmark it so that you know you're delivering something that is better, that is good, that is effective? What's your metric for that?
We have several categories in our quality scorecard, so to speak, and a couple of them are naturalness of the language, or the one that matters the most is naturalness of the language, how it flows. When it comes to transcreated content, obviously it becomes a bit tricky, and we rely on our lead reviewers and our language managers to utilize the existing categories we have and their knowledge of the culture and the target language to make a call that if this passes our quality bar or not.
And Christopher, where you have such profound experience on the content side of the house, editorial as well, I didn't mention that in your intro, I'm fascinated to understand a bit more about how you do the same thing. So how do you benchmark and or measure the quality of this high touch transcreated output?
So again, this is exactly what we're working on at the moment, and it's probably useful. Don't worry. It's if you ask me in a month's time, you'd get the fascinating insight. I think it's probably useful to point out that so indeed I look after all different types of content for Booking.com. Actually, we look after quite a lot of the copywriting and content writing, as well as let's say language-based services. So we're always looking to harmonize. We want to also evaluate not just quality of say a trans creation, but also quality of the input in the first place, which for me is extremely important. So we're actually trying to harmonize these systems at the moment. We have a single 100-point system, which will give us some sort of score, which we can then steer on. The critical thing for us, and we do monthly reviews, is that the feedback is actionable. Because at the end of the day, we want things to get better. We want to be learning. I think generally we see ourselves as a learning organization. Things will go wrong, inevitably, we completely accept that. But basically, how do we learn? How do we move forwards?
Well, thank you. And I know it's touching again on something that's a work in process, but this is very helpful, and you've wrestled with it on the content and editorial side of the house. Let's switch gears slightly, but I think staying still within this workflow or process around transcreation. In our earlier webinars, we focused quite a bit, as I mentioned, on this highly automated machine translation driven view of the world. In the world that we're talking about now, the individual, this talent, this resource that is being cast, to use agency terminology, seems to be very important. So I'd love to get your viewpoint on how you handle or staff or source for this type of work, whether you use different resources, different types of vendors have been mentioned already, but do you use translation vendors for the actual transcreation work? And especially if you've experimented all, have you looked at using different types of resourcing, or looked in different places other than a standard translation kind of resource? So Sasan, how about you? I know you've had a lot of experience kind of looking at different models, but what seems to be the one that you're using right now?
Sure. We initially started with a full transcreation team onboarded as part of a review vendor. And a lot of usage ended up being based on our business needs through light transcreation through existing reviewers, or the ones that had focus on marketing projects. So that's our current model. We utilize our existing review pool, and we rely on resources that have transcreation experience and marketing experience and are able to think creatively. It just optimizes for speed and the type of content we want to get. The challenge we have is that our account has been basically considered to be very complex for translators and reviewers to onboard. A term such as payment, it could have multiple glossary, or a driver could have multiple glossary definition based on if it's being on the driver side, is it our Uber Eats product? So we figured out it's better to follow our existing review pipeline and enhance the pool of resources to be transcreation focused.
Right, that's very clear and helpful. Christopher, I'm intrigued to know whether you have found that you can use translators, or if you've experimented, as many brands have, with using foreign language copy editors to do the content creation.
So I think it's useful to explain a little bit how we're kind of set up within Booking.com, because I don't think we're entirely typical. You asked earlier, to what extent does the kind of C-suite buy into, or the leadership of the company buy into localization? I think from the very, very, very beginning, we saw it as absolutely critical, to the point that we've always insourced most of our translations. So right now, actually, within Booking.com, we have 198 language specialists who are just part of the fabric of the business, and seen as, an utterly integral part of the business. As I mentioned, about 75% of them actually based in their local markets. So our Japanese team are entirely in Japan in Tokyo, and our traditional Chinese team are based in Taipei. Why? Because I want people who are completely bought into the brand, who completely understand what we're trying to achieve for our customers and for our partners, who are going to drive consistency, who are going to be flexible, I think is also incredibly important, but also, and then I think we touched a little bit upon the culture of Booking.com. We're a very bottom-up organization. We like to push ownership as far down the organization as possible. I actually believe when we talk about quality metrics, to me, this is hygiene, because you need a number that you're steering on. But ultimately, quality, I believe, is best served by having ownership, by having people who are just a fantastic cultural fit for the organization, who care about the brand, who care about consumer experience or partner experience, who want it to be as good as possible, who are going to work in a team, brainstorm, hit upon the right answer, not necessarily the fastest, but the right one. And so over time, build a really kind of compelling experience. So for me, this is the way that we've chosen to do it. And it's interesting, we do use machine translation, maybe we'll come back to that later, but for this sort of work, what we would call front-end work, consumer-facing or partner-facing work, super important that it's an in-house team. They just care a lot.
Well, you've described a nirvana of corporate support to the in-house kind of focused team. Don't be surprised if you've got, a zillion applications from people listening who want to work at Booking.com afterwards. But Sasan, this is a perfect segue. If you wouldn't mind sharing, because of course you've done something kind of innovative in the last 2 weeks with your Uber Localization Summit. Would you be comfortable sharing maybe a bit of an overview of what that was and the size and kind of focus of it?
Absolutely. I strongly believe that any kind of tools and technology created or utilized in localization industry is not going to be useful if we forget about the actual users of those technology, which are translators and reviewers, and we need to think about their productivity and just fundamentally treat them as human beings, because they're just being looked at a lot as just sometimes black box and robots that churn out words, and excuse for the expression. So I wanted to emphasize that we care about our resources and our extended localization family. We're financially, we're unable, and it doesn't make business sense for Uber to hire, hundreds of full-time employees. So this summit, which was the first one done to this magnitude from what I understand in the industry, was us inviting our lead translators and lead reviewers, so about close to 100 people. And globally, we brought them to Berlin, and we focused on collaboration, teamwork, educating about Uber products, and a token of appreciation that you're on our radar, we care about your issues, we're working on it, and you're not isolated. So it's been very well received, and we're looking forward to continue doing that on a regular basis.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Sasan. And I think what's fascinating is that both you and Christopher clearly are dealing with enormous volumes of content, the need to build a platform, a machine that can handle this at industrial scale, not kind of only company or individual scale. And yet, a big part of your focus is on this human side of engaging these resources, engendering a sense of shared culture and mission, which you both seem to have done very, very well. So I think that that's an ideal moment to now transition to, the other end of the spectrum, which is maybe your use of any machine translation approach that you've taken. And I'm curious, Christopher, whether you've used MT for less demanding types of content, I'm fascinated to know if you've tried it, or what you've come up with as a solution for reviewer content. And then I may probe and ask you both a few additional questions about kind of the how and the when. So first off, just your use of MT.
So absolutely, we do use MT. We've even published a couple of papers on the development we've done. I'm super proud of the team. So we decided to, again, insource it. Generally speaking, we like to be able to control experience as much as possible. And in any case, we've been translating for quite a long time, so we have pretty large corpuses, or very large corpuses, to be able to build MT models off. So I actually have a product development team, data scientist, developer, and a product owner just kind of building models. Mostly we're using this right now for the descriptions of our properties. And we find it's incredibly useful for properties which maybe aren't the most visited in the world. We've got close to 1.8 million accommodations on booking.com. So it's inevitably not everyone is looking in all languages at all properties all of the time. Historically, we translated according to demand. But with machine translation, it actually allows us to give total coverage in, for example, German. So we have 1.8 million descriptions all in German. Currently, we don't do any post-editing, which is to say we do a lot of offline testing before deploying a machine translation script. And we also A/B test just to make sure that it's not creating a negative consumer experience. For example, that it's not introducing critical errors, that it's, basically that it's trustworthy. This, for us, is incredibly important.
And have you any statistics, Chris, from prior to having, even the good enough content available? I think it's fascinating that you're just putting it out there without the post-edit. So I imagine, so prior to that, there was nothing. And then after that, there are these available listings. Have you seen any kind of business metrics that show the value of doing this?
A little early to say. Is the honest answer. We're tracking this, but we also expect it probably to take a few months for us to see any kind of really conclusive result. I think there is a principle that in booking.com we try to, we say a kind of at the highest level that we're here to empower people to experience the world. So I think for us, obviously language is one of the biggest barriers that there is when it comes to international travel. So I think for us, at any point that we can remove friction from the customer journey and even the partner journey, of course, because necessarily they probably speak different languages, anything we can do to reduce friction is fundamentally a good thing.
All right, and then Sasan, I'd like to ask you, I'll remind the audience, we will have a time for a few questions at the end. If you want to use your question window on the right-hand side of your screen and enter a question for either of the panelists, I'm sure they'd be thrilled to answer. And Sasan, I'll move over to you and ask about really any use of MT within your stack, and specifically kind of how do you decide what gets MT'd and what goes through another process, for example?
Sure. As I was mentioning, so we are a sort of a brand new team, 2.5 years old, and what we focused on in that time frame on my end has been building the team, onboarding 2 large MLVs, translators and reviewers to be our vendor of choice, and RFPing for a new TMS solution, and we just finished migration to that TMS provider. So now we are looking at MT solutions, neural MT, and what's out there in the market, and we would like to be able to connect those MT engines for some languages to our pipeline this year. So that's where we are as far as the MT is concerned.
Well, I think what's interesting is both panelists clearly have future things going on that will mean that we have to invite them back, right? I mean, what we're going to have to hear updates on some of these things. Chris, would you be comfortable sharing, are you using external commercial MT engines and specifically any neural MT solutions, or are you working more with internal technology?
So we do use neural models. we build them ourselves. As I say, we have a team of data scientists who are just working on these things. Yeah, we've published a couple of papers, so people can read about it. And some of the things we've learned along the way, particularly around what we call the business sensitivity framework, which is to say, make sure that there are certain critical errors that can never ever happen in post-processing. Yeah, it's all homegrown, neural, and we're actually looking at many other kind of interesting operational applications at the moment as well.
And so now, kind of coming back around to this ecosystem that involves the technology, as we've just discussed, but also the humans and the people. At a larger picture, how do you see jobs changing? And I think both of you have the experience to step back and really give us your view, not just on jobs within your own company, but really across the localization industry. If, as I've said now publicly, if you believe it is an industry, what do you think is happening, Sasan? How do you see that change rolling out?
I'd like to quote Ray Kurzweil, one of the visionaries of our time, that talks about, predicts that by year 2029, machine translation quality will be surpassing human level, not counting poetries. So I think that's a good benchmark for me to work through and understand that a lot of the resources may need to migrate to be more specialized, more niche market, whether it's transcreation, marketing, cultural ambassadors of a language. So I would see roles shifting within the next several years.
What about, Sasan, as you looking back on your depth of experience at Google and now the kind of world that you're managing at Uber, what's your view of the type of skill set you look for from your project managers or your, Christopher's mentioned kind of, the data scientists that he has? I mean, are you seeing a different need in terms of the types of team members you hire?
More versatile skills, definitely. I see that because business landscape is changing rapidly, so ability to adapt to different environment. Definitely core localization experience. I see that it's needed. When it's not utilized, usually results are not that great. When it comes to our translation and review resources, I like to use the analogy of Swiss Army knife. Someone who is very well balanced can do a bit of translation, a bit of review, a bit of transcreation, do QA, have some technical knowledge. So the more well-rounded an individual is, the better chance they would sort of survive this transition.
And Chris, do you see the same type of thing at your time at Booking.com?
I mean, often I get asked, particularly kind of by people who are about to study university or whatever, or straight after, like, hey, should I go into a career in translations? What do you think? And I say, well, if you're really interested in kind of literary translation, poetry, something like that, I think that's safe. I think generic translation inevitably is going to go more and more to MT over let's say the next 5 years. I think that's what's been discussed many places. Because I also think that the bar for translations quality will gradually be lowered as people get more and more used to MT, and at the same time MT will get better and better. I think sort of just-in-time translation, good enough translation. We live in a fairly kind of ephemeral world when it comes to content. Mm-hmm. However, when it comes to creating a really fantastic customer experience, I think this is where there is huge growth potential still. If I look at the language specialists that we have within Booking.com, they come from a range of different backgrounds. I mean, just as I studied history of art, we've actually got a few who studied history of art in the first place. It isn't necessarily kind of logical, but actually it's about culture. It's about understanding context, right? It's about understanding what are going to be the triggers or the things that cannot be said in a particular language or a particular culture. It's about passion and understanding brand and being able to convey that or translate that. And therefore, actually, I mean, I go out quite often. I visit language specialists. I was just in Zagreb last week with a Croatian team there, and I see they do market research. They're looking at what are other e-commerce platforms doing. How is language being used? How is language progressing? They look at, for example, the reviews that people leave on our site, and they look at the sort of language that's being used by consumers. And to a certain extent, we want to kind of mirror this. We want it to be as relevant as possible. This is, for me, so much more than translation. I've worked as a professional translator in the past, a few years ago. It's so much more. I mean, this is so much more exciting because it's about making a product or an experience relevant to a specific market. So I'm actually very excited. I think the work that can be automated will be automated, and that's just business. I think that's completely inevitable. But I think there's going to be a large tranche of work which can never fully be automated because it requires empathy. It requires warmth. It requires humanity, dare I say it. And the world can never have enough humanity, if you ask me.
I think that is just an absolute fantastic point on which to wrap. I'd be remiss, Susanne, if I didn't give you a chance to add in. But Chris, I thank you. Normally, I wind up the webinar kind of doing a summation and knitting things together. That's brilliant, and you certainly have made me, a modern languages major with a minor in computational linguistics, and I know Susanne's background with his Near East studies and Persian focus, but he wove in code and coding. We've all kind of come to the datification side of our jobs by I guess self-educating. But I love your comment that it really is about empathy. Susanne, how about you? What makes you still every morning want to get up and tackle this challenge at Uber?
For me, the mission and vision of our team as it ties to Uber, we want to make Uber feel local everywhere and for everyone, wherever we operate. So, and it's a very challenging task at a scale with millions of rides being taken every day. And so it's an exciting challenge that gets me going.
Well, I want to thank both of you. Susanne, you've shared so many great examples. Chris, you've really taken us on the journey, at Booking.com. It's been fantastic. I know it was a broad set of topics. I mean, we're bouncing from this high touch, high end output. But of course, I know that you're grappling with these other content flows as well. And I thank you both for being flexible and going with that. I'm sure the audience enjoyed it as well. Annamai, I think you'd probably love to bring us up to date on some of the upcoming events and exciting things that you have planned at TAUS. But I will thank the participants and the panelists at this point and hand over to you.
Thank you, Paula. Yes, indeed. So we have actually one event coming up in Amsterdam, this very small country indeed, Chris, in mid-June, where this topic, as well as the modern translation pipeline that was discussed in the previous two webinars, will be discussed again. All of the speakers that you've seen in the past 3 webinars, I believe, will be at the event. So they'll be brainstorming further. The focus on the Industry Leaders Forum is very much on the brainstorming. We have small groups working together in the Knowledge Cafe or World Cafe style. It will be a very interesting meeting, I think. Of course, we'll publish a report afterwards again. And then we go on a short break for the summer. No webinars either, but we'll be back with webinars in September. And also our in-person events will be on the west coast of Canada and America, in Vancouver first on 10-11 October with the annual conference, followed by a quality evaluation summit at Microsoft in Seattle and a data summit at Amazon in Seattle as well. So hopefully we'll see you at one of these, and if not, one of the webinars again. For now, thank you also, Chris and Susanne and Paula, for this great webinar. Very inspiring. And
thanks for having us.
Good. Have a good evening or day for you all, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.